This is a close read of a letter between President Abraham Lincoln and General George McClellan written on October 13, 1862. Mr. Lincoln and General McClellan were about as opposite as one can imagine. The tall, lean president towered over his shorter and stouter general. McClellan came from a wealthy and well-connected Philadelphia family, while Lincoln experienced a hardscrabble frontier childhood. McClellan tended towards arrogance, and the president was capable of great humility. Sometimes opposites complement each other, but that was not the case with President Lincoln and General McClellan. The day after the Union defeat at First Bull Run, General McClellan was summoned to Washington to take command of the Department of the Potomac. He began his tenure with a gracious visit to the aged General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. This was probably his last gracious act as Lincoln's principal general. Returning to the theme of arrogance, within a few days of arriving in the capital, McClellan asserted to his wife that he had already come to understand the reasons for the recent reverses and was in the process of setting them right. McClellan was overwhelmed by the adulation he had received from all quarters and developed a bit of a messianic complex, believing that Providence had selected him to save the nation. Well, ultimately, days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and with the exception of the disastrous battle at Ball's Bluff, the Army of the Potomac remained idle. The winter of 1861 and 1862 was probably the lowest point in the war for President Lincoln. His army was stalled on all fronts, his commanding general was flat on his back with fever, and according to Secretary Chase, the government was out of money. In January of 1862, President Lincoln issued what he called General War Order No. 1, in which he chose February 22nd, Washington's birthday, as a day that all Union land and naval forces should advance against the enemy. This order, combined with the fact that Lincoln had been consulting with McClellan's lieutenants, was enough to rouse the young Napoleon from his sickbed and for him to finally share his plans for the spring campaign with the commander-in-chief. McClellan laid out to a skeptical Lincoln a complicated plan to attack Richmond from the east by water route rather than taking the direct overland approach through Richmond. The president didn't see the point of trying to capture real estate when the rebel army ought to be the true objective, and figured that McClellan would wind up fighting the same Confederate forces in even stronger entrenchments. After a vigorous defense of his strategy by McClellan, Lincoln finally assented to what would become known as the Peninsula Campaign. In May of 1862, McClellan found himself stalled in front of Yorktown. Much to the president's annoyance, McClellan insisted that he was facing a mighty host which could only be reduced by a proper siege. For a month, 11,000 Confederates held a Union army of roughly 75,000 men at bay because McClellan would not attack or even probe the Confederate lines. The capture of the empty trenches at Yorktown was probably the high point of the campaign for George McClellan. Although he would get to within the sight of the spires of Richmond, he would be driven back over a series of battles which came to be known as the 7 Days and find himself pretty much back at the starting point, not far from Fortress Monroe. At this point, Lincoln decided to give another general a shot at commanding the army, turned over command to General Pope, who went forward and was thoroughly trashed at the Second Battle of Bull Run. With the defeat of General Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln had very few options, and pretty much the only thing he could do was he could take General McClellan and put him back in command of the Army of the Potomac. Now, the principal reason why the president did this was because, for all his faults, General McClellan was a favorite of the Army. The men believed in him, they were revived by his presence, and Lincoln figured that if McClellan can't fight, he exceeds at preparing others to fight. So with very few options available to Lincoln, General McClellan is going to take command of the Army. This brings us to the Antietam campaign, from which our close read comes. As Lee moved north into Maryland on the western side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, General McClellan was pursuing him on the eastern side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Ultimately, the two armies would meet at Antietam Creek, just north of the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Battle of Antietam is important for a variety of reasons. First of all, it is the bloodiest day in American military history. Second, while it was not much of a victory, it was enough of a victory for Lincoln to finally issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. From the Union perspective, the Battle of Antietam was a badly managed battle. McClellan's forces were introduced into the battle in a piecemeal fashion. He held back a significant reserve and ultimately allowed Lee's army to escape back across the Potomac River, having been bloodied but not defeated. Antietam was fought in the middle of September 1862. The letter that we are about to read comes from the middle of October 1862. Executive Mansion, Washington, October 13th, 1862. Major General McClellan. My dear sir, you remember me speaking to you of what I called your overcautiousness. Are you not overcautious when you assume that you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing? Should you not claim to be at least his equal in prowess and act upon that claim? McClellan was a slow guy. As battle approached, to become incredibly timid and incredibly concerned about having all his T's crossed and his I's dotted. He would not move until his army was absolutely accoutered to his satisfaction, and in reality, it never really quite got to the level of his satisfaction. As I understand, you telegraphed General Halleck that you cannot subsist your army at Winchester unless the railroad from Harper's Ferry to that point be put in working order. But the enemy does now subsist his army at Winchester at a distance nearly twice as great from railroad transportations as you would have to do without the railroad last named. He now wagons from Culpepper Courthouse, which is just about twice as far as you would have to do from Harper's Ferry. He is certainly not more than half as well provided with wagons as you are. I certainly should be pleased for you to have the advantage of the railroad from Harper's Ferry to Winchester, but it wastes all the remainder of the autumn to give it to you, and in fact ignores the question of time, which cannot and must not be ignored. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, Lincoln has always tried to sustain and provide General McClellan with everything he could possibly want or need. He has shown immense patience with the man up until this point, but he has constantly also reminded McClellan of the importance of the political pressure to move, to act, to succeed, to pursue the enemy. And McClellan has been indifferent to that political pressure. It is now a month since the victory at Antietam, and still he sits in place. So Lincoln now is sort of gently trying to bring him back, bring his attention back to the imperative of time. The fall is wasting, the roads are dry, the weather's good. There's no better time to campaign in Northern Virginia than in October, in September, October, and McClellan really needs to get after it. That's essentially what he's saying here. Exclusive of the waterline, you are now nearer Richmond than the enemy is by the route that you can and he must take. Why can you not reach there before him, unless you admit that he is more than your equal on the march? His route is the arc of a circle, while yours is the chord. The roads are as good on yours as on his. Now again, Lincoln shows a little bit of his understanding of military strategy here. You know, he came to Washington with virtually no military understanding at all. He has drawn upon General Winfield Scott. He has drawn upon McClellan himself. He has done immense studying of the military arts, and he's beginning to get a pretty good understanding of how military strategy plays out and where advantages can be found. And the point he's trying to make out to him is that in this particular instance, essentially, McClellan has got the interior lines, and Lee finds himself on the outside of this geographic problem. I would press closely to him, fight him if a favorable opportunity should present, and at least try to beat him to Richmond on the inside track. I say try. If we never try, we shall never succeed. If he make a stand at Winchester, moving neither north or south, I would fight him there, on the idea that if we cannot beat him when he bears the wastage of coming to us, we never can when we bear the wastage of going to him. This proposition is a simple truth, and is too important to be lost sight of for a moment. In coming to us, he tenders us an advantage which we should not waive. There's a lot of good information here. Lincoln again goes back and emphasizes the idea of the inside track. He really understands that the key to victory is defeating Lee and defeating Lee's army. Again, going to Richmond is really just a means of drawing Lee into battle. And he's hoping that Lee, in using up his forces pursuing McClellan, will be that much easier to beat. But if Lee will not come to him, then we're going to have to go to Lee. We should not so operate as to merely drive him away, as we must beat him somewhere or fail finally. We can do it, if at all, easier near to us than far away. If we cannot beat the enemy where he is now, we never can. he again being within the entrenchments of Richmond. It is all easy if our troops march as well as the enemy, and it is unmanly to say they cannot do it. You can really begin to see Lincoln's frustration in this letter. I mean, he's really kind of laying out just basic elementary military strategy for his general. He desperately wants him to move. He desperately wants McClellan to succeed, and he doesn't know quite how to do it. Again, you know, there are some slight digs here. I mean, that idea that there is some unmanliness involved in this is certainly to try to motivate McClellan. After laying out these fundamental military truths to the general, he tries to kind of recover the tone of the letter, I think, by saying this is in no sense an order. Trying to recover a good working relationship with the general by basically letting himself realize the obvious nature of the situation and himself generate the orders necessary to pursue the enemy army. Lincoln is not going to preemptorily order McClellan forward, but I think Lincoln feels that this clearly will impel him to do something. It doesn't impel him to do something. As a matter of fact, he does even more nothing than he has done before. A few days later, the famous, I don't know what the horses have been doing to tie, I don't know what exactly you've been doing to tire out your horses telegram from Lincoln is sent to McClellan. A day or so after Lincoln sent that famous telegram to General McClellan, he will back off of it a little bit and again try to soothe the general's ego, but again prod him to move forward. Now ultimately, McClellan is not going to cross the Potomac until perhaps the 2nd of November, 1862. And by this point, Lincoln has pretty much had it with the general. I believe on November 7th, 1862, General Burnside arrives with the order relieving McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac. And that sort of pretty much brought an end to sort of the military career of General George B. McClellan, who was ordered to essentially head to Trenton, New Jersey, and wait there until further orders.